Good morning and welcome back to Sunday Driver with me, Mark Stone. This morning we are joined by David Lawson, Chairman of the Preston District Vintage Car Club, enthusiastic vintage Bentley owner, a proper vintage Bentley, that's one made by W. or Walter Owen Bentley down in sunny Cricklewood, and shall we say sporting gentleman. He's always liked driving old cars, but there is a reason. Good morning, David, welcome to the show.
Morning, Mark.
How did you get into vintage cars?
Well, it really started back in student days when that's all you could afford. And I started off with a Morris 8, a 1935 Morris 8, and gradually went on to better cars from there on in. But my boss came in one day with a 3-litre Bentley, and it was a prize that there was going to go through, and he suggested that we all had a drive of it. Most of them weren't interested, but I was. And he said, well, go up to the house and pick it up. Never having driven a car before with a central accelerator and this style of gear change on the right-hand side, crash box, of course, I was left with it and to drive the 5 miles back to the works. And I can tell you I was on my own, and when I stopped at the dual carriageway, the traffic stopped entirely on both sides of the dual carriageway to get me out. And of course I kangaroo hopped across, and most embarrassing, but that was the first time.
Because it's always been, you talk about the gearbox, it's always been the thing I was once told, every time you change gear in a Bentley, you will hear a little noise. It'll confirm it's found the appropriate ratio. It's like you said, the gear levers are on the outside, the accelerator is in the middle. Unlike the modern car where the throttle's out on the right, you've got a small pedal between the brake and the clutch. That is the throttle. It's a whole different ball game compared to the modern vehicle.
Well, it is, but you do get used to it. I mean, I've travelled, 80,000, 90,000 miles in this car now, all over the place. And it is usable, but if you do forget, it does give you a heart-stopping moment, or a change of underpants even.
Because you've driven what year is your vintage Bentley?
1928.
Which is a 3-litre, if memory serves. Last time I saw it.
4.5.
4.5. Right. Oh, it's a proper Bentley then.
Oh, it is. It goes well.
Yeah, but you were saying you've driven it in some very unusual places. The age of the car and the fact it is now a very desirable car has no effect on where you drive it and what you do with it.
Oh no! It's taken us a lot of places. The first outing we did in it was to South Africa, but since then we've had it in the States 5 times, Canada 4, New Zealand, Jordan, and on the continent both years. So it has done a lot of miles abroad as well as in the UK.
I mean, in many respects, your car was built as a touring machine, wasn't it?
It was. It is an original body. Mr. Bentley himself specified the body for this car. Why he did it, we don't know, because usually they sold just a chassis to the body makers, and they bodied it and it was sold on. But this particular one was probably done for demonstration or whatever, but it was a sold car, and the first owner was Mr. Burberry of Raincoat fame.
Oh right. So I mean that's the one thing about them. But even back then, they weren't a cheap car, but they were sort of car that, shall we say, keen motorists purchased.
Oh yes, you'd have to be keen. But you'd have to be well heeled too. I mean, that car in pre-war days would be more than a detached house now.
And the other thing was, as you mentioned then, a lot of people don't realise this, when you bought a car back in those days, be it a Bentley, Rolls Royce, you bought a chassis with, shall we say, the bonnet fitted. You then decided on the type of bodywork you may like to have on. So that's why you could say there could be 4.5 litre Bentleys parked up in a row, and every one will have a different body on. And it's because the original owners all chose a different style of body.
Oh, absolutely. You could have, obviously, most cars are open then because closed cars are more difficult to make. So they make a lot of open cars as they did in the pre-war days. But Bentley also had a funny one where you went down to take your car out, somebody would take you around the block in the car, give you a demonstration how it worked, then you took it out And if they didn't think you were a particularly good driver, they would alter the gearbox or give you a C box instead of a D box and so forth to suit your driving. And if they thought you were a sporting driver, they gave you, say, perhaps a D box.
Yeah.
Unknown to you.
Yeah. So, I mean, this was in the days when buying a car was it was a more civilised process, really, in its way compared to how you do it today.
Well, cars are made to measure in a lot of cases. Rolls-Royce, particularly, if it was Lady and Sir so-and-so, he would have a car made to fit her legs in the back. So the seat would be raised up, the floor would be raised to suit her stature, and the same with him. And of course, the old chappie in the front who's the chauffeur, he would have a very stiff seat stuffed in the front there, and very difficult to drive at times because they were so small. Shall
we say, for the owner who was sat in the back being chauffeured around in luxury, many times the communication with the chauffeur was via a speaking trumpet, wasn't it? The owner didn't have to lower themselves to actually deal face to face with them.
Oh no, absolutely. The glass screen between the two of them, and as you say, a speaking trumpet.
Right, when we come back, we'll be talking to David what exactly it is about vintage cars, and we will point out that vintage is an era. So when you hear that absolutely cringing statement on television by people who haven't done their research, they're in their vintage MG, they're in their vintage E-Type. Here's a heads up, folks. There is no such thing as a vintage MG or E-Type. They are classes. The term vintage applies to a very specific age of car. Good morning and welcome back to Sunday Driver with me, Mark Stone, and David Lawson, chairman of the Preston District Vintage Car Club. Now, just while we're talking, during the break there, we were discussing the fact that vintage cars are from a very specific era, and that, as I said, there are vintage MGs, but they're of an age. So I was meaning really MGBs. What qualifies as a vintage car, or how do they classify your veterans, your Edwardians, your vintage, your post-vintage, then your classics?
Well, it started off really, there was one club in particular that classified them. There's the pre-1905s, which is the Brighton cars, which most people be veterans. They roughly to about 1910. Then the Edwardians up to 20. Then the vintage class really is from 1920 to 1930. Then post-vintage thoroughbred from 1930 to 40. However, nowadays, because things have got smudged around a bit and the classic cars have come in, basically the vintage we now tend to smudge over a longer period, and as the Preston District do, it's cars up to 1940. And we tend to consider anything after this period of post-war cars to be classic. So we have basically two defined areas now, I would suggest, more than the tight areas they had before, which I don't think were totally right.
Now, the one thing you know about vintage cars, or I know about vintage cars, by virtue of the fact I commentate at a lot of car shows, the vintage always attract attention. There's something about vintage cars, there's something about the aura, and the fact that in most instances, it's the owner that's restored the car, because there are one or two specialists out there, but you can't just bob it in your local garage and say, fix that.
Well, that's true. I mean, local garages are very good, but of course nowadays they tend to be called technicians rather than motor mechanics. And you tend to then get this definition of you need an old-fashioned engineering shop to do a lot of these cars. And in the old workshops, and in fact most of our workshops now, you find of the lads who are working on the cars, probably this morning, listening to this, are working with perhaps a lathe in there and a milling machine and other machinery to keep the parts up to date for the cars or manufacture new parts. In the old days, most garages had a lathe and would turn up parts or recondition parts and so forth. And this is basically what we do now, is in the interest of the hobby.
So, can you actually get spare parts for some of these cars?
Oh, absolutely. You'd be surprised. Taking Bentley in particular, even the 20s Bentleys, you can still buy parts off the shelf. And quite often as not, if you're known to them in the club, you'll find the part will be there next day, unpaid for, and they'll just expect you to bob a cheque in the post whenever, in the next week or so.
Because the other thing is with vintage cars, they require, shall we say, probably a little bit more maintenance than a lot of modern drivers are used to. You look round and there's plenty of lubrication points on them. And suspension, it's not a gas-filled shocker anymore. It's leaf springs or things that require adjusting to keep them as they should be. I mean, owning a vintage car isn't just a case of I own a vintage car. It's probably a way of life and a dedicated profession.
Well, to get round the lubrication part of it, I mean, to do a full service can take some time just to on the greasing or oiling around of the parts itself. And there can be as many as 40 or 50 nipples to be adjusted or to be not to be adjusted, actually be lubricated. And this takes time. And then you've got the engine itself to change the oil, maybe if it's been had a modern filter on it, and the gearbox and the back axle. By the time you do a full service, you're taking a full day at it.
Because the other thing they used to have to de-coke engines of that era quite regularly, didn't they?
Well, they did, but this was really down to poor quality fuel. They produced a lot of carbon and of course poor quality oils we had as well, and they produced a lot, and we got a lot of oil up the bores, and this caused a lot of problems, and they had to be decoked, get all this rubbish out of them. It was a fairly quick process with a side valve engine. Overhead valves are a lot quicker. I mean, we've done decokes technically in sort of an hour or two, but we don't do it nowadays. Petrols are clean, everything, fuel's clean in itself, and so is the oils, and they're excellent now.
I conclude then, like especially with the petrol, there'll be appropriate additives to put in because they were used to running on, though it was poor quality, it was leaded petrol.
Well, not necessarily. The lead only came out. Tetraethyl lead came out in the mid-30s, perhaps a shade before. But before, all the vintage stuff, if you like, all the 1930s cars were produced, and they were running on just pure petrol. There was no additives in it. And of course, cars before that ran on benzene, which you could get from your local chemist, as they did in the early days. So yes, it was just down to poor quality fuel, really.
But the one thing is, besides the maintenance and various other things, you were saying you've run abroad with your cars. These cars, though they're old, are incredibly comfortable. When they're up and running, they'll keep up with any modern car to it. In fact, some of them, like your Bentley, is more than capable of shall we say, humbling a modern car at times. Well,
it can be. I mean, as I say, we've had these cars all over the world, and we've really enjoyed it. But on the motorway today standards, I can keep up with the modern traffic at 70, 75 and more.
That's where permitted, of course.
Oh, yes. But, of course, these things really don't have the brakes. That's where they fall back. And you're belting along at these speeds, and you leave a nice big gap in front, and all of a sudden you see something happening, you start to brake, and then this person on your right-hand side suddenly takes your braking distance up by swinging in front of you. And naughty words are said.
Yes, they don't exactly screech to a halt. You get the brakes will squeal, but they don't squeal to a halt a lot of the time.
That's true.
Right, welcome back to the third bit with David Lawson, chairman of the Preston District Vintage Car Club, vintage Bentley owner, and sporting gentleman to boot. David, the vintage movement, I mean, it's an enthusiastic movement, though it, shall we say, maybe a little bit niche. Those who are into them are very enthusiastic about them.
Well, they are. There are a lot of clubs catering for specific marks of car. The Preston District caters for all marks of car made before 1940. So if you can pick up anything, a Wolseley, a Morris, whatever you fancy, whatever you can afford. And of course, most of the cars these days, affordable-wise, are saloons built in that period. And they can be very usable cars as well. Of course, people also like sports cars, the MGs, etc. So there are a lot of cars to go at, depending on your budget.
There's also lots of things you can do besides, I mean, if you don't have a vintage car, you can join socially. But if you have a vintage car, you can do the tours. You can do the road navigations, and if you've the appropriate piece of machinery, you can go and do the trials, and that's serious motorsport, back as like what it used to be.
Well, it is, but the thing is with trialling, that a lot of people don't like doing it now because you can sort of make the mess of the car a little bit. But by and large, they are very good fun, and you can produce a car especially for trialling. A lot of Austin 7s have ended up that way for that style of motoring. Of course, you've got to have everything else, as I say, with across the board, and a lot of people aren't terribly interested in doing anything else but perhaps going out for a Sunday run, or alternatively taking it to a rally where they can sit with their deck chair, and if they're happy enough to do that, that's fine, that's their interest.
I mean, looking at the Preston and District Vintage Car Club, I'm breaking these in for my mates always. The calendar of events for 2017, there's over 25 events listed for this year alone, and over time other things will get added, so it's an enthusiastic club that does a lot of things, even if it's only meeting on, because there's one I think where you guys meet on a Wednesday night for a pie and a pint and mutter about the world as a whole.
Well, that's true, we do have social nights. Now take next the February the 14th, Valentine's night, Transport of Delights at Pleasington Golf Club. For £10 it's a pie and peas, and also they are bringing along a lot of old photographs, which we have. This is the third time we've done it, and it's very interesting seeing the old photographs from the periods before the war and in the 20s. And on the 15th, the day after, there is a midweek lunch which you can take your vintage or whatever car. A lot of people will come in classics that period along to the midweek lunch, and of course as the weather gets better, of course more cars will come out. On the 26th there's a Sunday social and walk, and it carries on like this right through the year. There's even a holiday for a few days in Yorkshire, scatter rallies and so forth, right down to the end of the year, of course, when we come down to the Christmas lunch. So something for everybody. You don't have to be competitive, you don't have to be sticking a finger on the map and following everything around. Sometimes it's a left and right navigation, and it's quite simple. Other times it can be more testing, and you could do what you want to do.
But that's the one thing, whether they're members of the Preston District Vintage Car Club, which, by the way, folks, if you go onto all the W's, pdvcc.co.uk, that's pdvcc.co.uk to find out more, the members use their cars. They're keen on driving them. They don't just polish them and shut the garage doors again. Away they go.
Yes, that's basically very true. A lot of them do bring them out. We have 200 paid members in the club, which will mean there are well over 200 cars. And we can get, at a good turnout, you can get 30, 40 cars. On an ordinary turnout, on a social, we can get sort of a number of new cars, but we do tend to get one or two people bringing modern cars, which is really a good reason if they've got another car off, but not such a good reason if they haven't.
But if your vintage car is off the road, for whatever reason, the club doesn't mind you turning up in your modern car.
Not at all, particularly if it's a classic. I mean, you're obviously trying to keep in the sync with a car, say 40 years or 50 years old, maybe an MGB even, and or a Stag or something of a modern ilk, or even going right the way back to just post-war cars like Alvis's and so forth. But obviously your preferred car would be to come in at pre-40s.
David Lawson, chairman of the Preston District Vintage Car Club, Bentley driver extraordinaire, thank you very much for coming on the show and giving us a clue as to what really goes on within the vintage car movement.